President Clinton's deficit reduction plan not only reduced deficit as planned, it eliminated it entirely and gave incoming President George W. Bush a record surplus. In fact, when President Bush took office, we were on track to completely pay off our national debt with $5 trillion of surpluses projected over the next 10 years. In other words, we would have zeroed out our national debt this year. 5 days after President Bush took office, again, after President Bush took office, Alan Greenspan testified to the Senate Budget Committee that we were in danger of paying off the national debt too quickly and entering uncharted territory in which the federal government would have too much money. The federal government, Greenspan warned, would have to put its excess money into private equities, thereby distorting and decreasing the efficiency of our markets. President Bush told the country that a surplus meant that Americans were paying too much in taxes. This was our money, he told us, and so we all deserved a tax cut. Then, after the economy went into recession, Bush told us that what we needed was another tax cut to stimulate the economy. So, in other words, when the economy is strong, tax cuts are in order. And when the economy is weak, tax cuts are in order. Combine those with the aforementioned contradictory tax cuts reduce revenues, forcing government to spend less of our money, and tax cuts always increase revenues, and you have an exquisitely incomprehensible economic theory. But that exquisitely incomprehensible theory needed just one more element to make it downright dangerous, and that element would be provided by Vice President Richard Cheney. By late 2002, the surplus that President George W. Bush had inherited from Bill Clinton was turning once again into huge deficits. According to then Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, he tried to warn Vice President Cheney that budget deficits were growing at an alarming rate, posing a threat to the economy. Vice President Cheney cut O'Neill off, saying, "You know, Paul, Reagan proved deficits don't matter." By the end of his presidency, George W. Bush left President Obama a budget deficit projected at $1.2 trillion for fiscal year 2009. Meanwhile, President Bush had doubled our national debt and left President Obama an economy that was hemorrhaging 750,000 jobs a month. So, who's to blame on this deficit? Could it have had anything to do with the fact that for the first time in history we cut taxes while we were at war? Well, not according to the Republican leader. In July of last year, Senator McConnell said, and I quote, "There is no evidence whatsoever that the Bush tax cuts actually diminished revenue. But adjusting for inflation, since the Bush tax cuts were enacted, revenues have fallen 17%. And that's not even taking into account the growth in our population, which was 9% over this period. When you add the effect of population growth, revenues declined by about 24% per capita under the Bush tax cuts. I think this clearly constitutes evidence that the Bush tax cuts actually diminish revenue. So it should be no surprise that our reduced revenues are responsible for a lot of our deficit, as you can see in this chart here. This chart is by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It's based on CBO numbers and shows that the Bush tax cuts were responsible for 25% of our debt in 2010, and that's only going to grow. As you'll see, it's the debt, the tax cuts are this orange part of our debt here, and you can see that it goes to about 60% in 2019. And the fact is, not only did the national debt double during the Bush administration. We also just had a dismal record of job creation. And during the Bush years, for the first time since we started keeping records, median income fell in America. And more Americans fell into poverty. 1 in 5 children in America now lives in poverty. It's even higher in rural America. There is one group that did very well during the Bush years and that continues to do very well, the extremely wealthy. We now have in this country the greatest disparity in income and wealth that we have had since the 1920s. So the one thing that there is no evidence whatsoever of is that cutting taxes on the wealthiest Americans can create jobs and keep the deficit under control. So why would we do it? When the evidence is so stark that the Bush tax cuts coincided with a huge spike in both the debt and unemployment. Why not look back on what has worked in the past and learn from it? As I said earlier, after World War II, our debt as a percentage of GDP was, in fact, significantly larger than it is today. But what did we do? Well, we passed the GI Bill so that our troops returning from the war could go to college. Truman started the Marshall Plan to help Europe get on its feet. And it's not as if we had smooth sailing as far as defense spending. We went to war in Korea, losing nearly 35,000 Americans. After that war ended, we found ourselves in an extended, protracted Cold War. We built the largest infrastructure project in our history, the interstate highway system. It added enormously to our economic development because now we could transport our goods around the country so much more efficiently.